Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Chip Manikin for organizing the symposium and Marcia for her generous introduction. As you can see, as you will immediately be able to see, even though Shmuel and I have edited a volume together on the Haskalah, we take very different views of Moses Mendelssohn. So whereas Shmuel was arguing for a secularizing Mendelssohn, I'll be arguing for Mendelssohn as a figure of what I call the religious Enlightenment, a kind of moderate version of the Enlightenment that included religious belief. In order to explain that understanding of Mendelssohn, I'm going to talk about the shifts in the scholarship on Mendelssohn and the scholarship on the Enlightenment that have made that possible. And I'm going to talk about those two shifts as two sorts of straitjackets in the scholarship. And I'll be doing so by beginning with a quotation from Ismar Schorsch, the distinguished historian and former chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. So let me begin with that quotation. In the field of historical inquiry, accepted patterns of thought often interfere with new empirical research. The conceptual equipment a historian brings to explore unknown terrain may just be unsuited for the task and serve to distort rather than delineate the contours of his topic. This proper understanding of many a new subject has long been delayed by an instinctive application of well-worn notions that make it difficult to approach the subject at hand without blinders. Should those notions about the past also be in error, the difficulty in studying a new topic is twice compounded. It may thus take sometimes a generation or two before historians are able to free themselves from the straitjacket of earlier conceptualizations in order to conduct their research in terms dictated by the subject itself. Now, Moses Mendelssohn is just such an instance of what Ismar Schorsch had in mind. Our view of Mendelssohn has changed dramatically in the past 2 decades as he has been liberated from 2 scholarly or historiographical straitjackets. First, there is the straitjacket of Germanization that long relegated Mendelssohn's Hebrew works to the margins. We are now aware that Mendelssohn wrote in Hebrew throughout his career, and that we must consider his Hebrew works in conjunction with his German writings in order to achieve a complete understanding of his thinking. Second, there was the straitjacket of the Enlightenment being seen as a secular or secularizing phenomenon, which limited our view of Mendelssohn's relationship to or place in the Enlightenment. We are now aware that religion has a larger and more positive place in the European Enlightenment than scholars previously asserted, a development which makes it possible to cease seeing Mendelssohn as a singular figure. We are now able to locate him among like-minded peers with whose intellectual commitments and projects his can be compared. I would like to survey these 2 developments, a new emphasis on the Hebrew works and a new understanding of the relationship of religion to the Enlightenment, in order to show their combined impact on Mendelssohn's scholarship. Let me begin with the historiographical straitjacket particular to Mendelssohn, the place of his Hebrew works. Ever since the 1843-45 edition of Mendelssohn's collected works, the first attempt at collecting his works, scholars have presented him primarily, though at times exclusively, as a German thinker, that is, a prominent figure of the Berlin Enlightenment or Aufklärung, and the preeminent Jewish intellectual of his day who wrote in German. Scholars have always acknowledged that he also wrote in Hebrew, yet have consistently ignored or marginalized those works by failing to take account of their contents. This Germanization of Mendelssohn dominated the scholarship into the 1980s and still has followers today. The 1843 to 45 collected works, the so-called Gesammelte Schriften in 7 volumes, was sponsored by the Mendelssohn family, which by that point, either converted or distant from Judaism, was eager to emphasize the German character of their forebears' Uv. In the biography that preceded the 7 volumes, Mendelssohn's son, Joseph, a successful banker, produced striking misconceptions that have circulated widely ever since. To name just a few, Joseph saw his father as having remained Jewish not out of inner conviction, but rather in order to reform his people. The implication was that his father was a closet unbeliever or deist who calculatingly disguised his true beliefs so as to carry on his effort at reform. Joseph asserted without any evidence that the rabbis had suppressed the Kohelet Musar, the journal in Hebrew that Mendelssohn had authored or co-authored sometime in the late 1750s. Joseph thought his father disdained Yiddish, and that the aim of the Pentateuch translation was to dislodge it while leading Jews away from the Talmud to the Bible. In the edition itself, the closest one gets to Mendelssohn's Hebrew works is the introduction to Mendelssohn's translation of the 5 books of Moses, prepared by Haman Yolovitz, a Hebraist and later a scholar of Iberian Jewry. Yolovitz ably summarized Mendelssohn's introduction to the Bible, the Light for the Path, Or La Netivah. Yet the text that appeared was exclusively German. The German translation, now printed in Latin letters, as originally it had been printed in Hebrew letters, stood on its own in isolation from the Hebrew texts that originally accompanied it. The Bible, the commentary in Hebrew, and the notes on the Masoretic text in Hebrew. Meyer Kaiserling's 1862 biography, the first definitive scholarly biography, and for a century the definitive scholarly account, similarly perpetuated the Germanization of Mendelssohn. Kaiserling understood Mendelssohn to be a sincere believer. He wrote, for example, quote, "He was rooted with every fiber of his inner self in his belief and lived strictly according to Talmudic precepts." Kaiserling mentioned the Hebrew works, especially the introduction to Ecclesiastes, and lauded the translation of Psalms and the Pentateuch, which he understood, quote, "to foster jointly Judaism and German education, Bildung." Yet, Kaiserling marginalized the Hebrew works by saying nothing of their contents. His concluding characterization of Mendelssohn confirmed this, quote, "Mendelssohn was a sincere religious Jew and a German writer who was a noble model for posterity." End of quote. Kaiserling did not mention Mendelssohn as a Hebrew writer. We find a similar Germanization of Mendelssohn in the major historians of the late 19th and early 20th century, for example, Heinrich Gretz or Simon Dubnov, or in the first major encyclopedia of Jewish studies in English, the monumental Jewish Encyclopedia, published between 1901 and 1906, all of whom followed Kaiserling in their descriptions of Mendelssohn. The 20-volume Jubilee edition of Mendelssohn's works, published in Berlin beginning in 1929 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Mendelssohn's birth, would have brought the Hebrew works to the fore. Historical circumstances changed them. The crucial volume 14, which contained all of the Hebrew works, appeared in November 1938. The Nazis immediately seized and pulped it, so that only a few copies survived. The volume was first made widely available to scholars when it was reissued in a facsimile version as part of the revived Jubilee edition in 1972. Alexander Altman's authoritative biography of 1973, Moses Mendelssohn, A Biographical Study, also perpetuated the Germanization of Mendelssohn. Altman produced a monumentally researched and scrupulously written biography that supplied a wealth of detail about Mendelssohn's life and thought based on all of the available evidence in libraries and archives, public and private. The biography is an exemplary work of scholarship. Altman in particular offered detailed accounts of the genesis and contents of all of the major and minor philosophical works in German. In regard to the Hebrew works, however, Altman either made them subordinate to the German ones or treated them in relationship to Mendelssohn's reformatory efforts. For the Pentateuch translation and commentary, for example, Altman offered the reader 2 highlights. He didn't do that for any of the German works. He did not treat any of the German works in a similar way. Altman characterized Mendelssohn as living in 2 disparate worlds, the modern Enlightenment and Judaism. Yet he did not devote equal attention to the contents of Mendelssohn's Judaism as expressed in his Hebrew works, even though he acknowledged the, quote, beauty and precision of language in Mendelssohn's, quote, extensive literary output in Hebrew. Even in his summary of the evidence for understanding Mendelssohn's Judaism, Altman failed to mention the Hebrew works aside from the Bible Project. Quote, his reply to Lafayette's challenge, his formidable Bible Project, his tussles with the rabbis, his formulations of his view of Judaism in Jerusalem, his response to Lessing's Nathan the Wise, the way he educated his children, these and many more items in his biography add up to the final answer to the question, what was his Judaism like? The Germanization of Mendelssohn distorted the interpretation of Mendelssohn for some 13 or 14 decades, really for a century and a half or more. It prevented the examination of the full scope of Mendelssohn's Jewish thought and a fuller assessment of the relationship of his Jewish thought to the Enlightenment. Yet the Germanization was not solely culpable. It combined with the regnant view of the Enlightenment the second straitjacket to which I now turn. Scholarship on the Enlightenment has divided into a number of alternative approaches or schools in the last half-century. The dominant school since the late 1960s was that of the Enlightenment as a unitary phenomenon of secularization. Peter Gay's award-winning and elegantly written two-volume synthesis, The Enlightenment and Interpretation, 2 volumes published between 1966 and 1969, established this view of the Enlightenment as a unitary phenomenon that had changed the course of European culture by driving religion to the margins. Alistair McIntyre's coining of the term Enlightenment Project in his 1981 After Virtue, a study in moral theory, reinforced Gay's notion of a unitary enlightenment, even though his denigration of the Enlightenment was diametrically opposed to Gay's idealization. Subsequently, both friends and foes adopted the view of the Enlightenment as a unitary phenomenon of secularization. That view remains so dominant even today to be a cliche in the academy, not to mention in the press. Now to take 2 examples to show how this notion of the unitary enlightenment affected the scholarship. Michael Myers' The Origins of the Modern Jew, published in 1967, a lucid and elegant introduction which devotes 2 chapters to Mendelssohn and has been used in college classrooms ever since its publication, and I first encountered Mendelssohn as more than just a name when I read it as an undergraduate, understood the Enlightenment to consist of ideas, quote, that tore away much of the foundation upon which Christianity has been built, including such concepts as, quote, universal human nature, universal natural law, and universal rationality. Meyer argued that in Germany in particular, deism and natural theology reigned supreme in the wake of Christian Wolff's philosophy, elevating reason to the sole standard for religious belief. For Meyer, Mendelssohn adopted this criterion of reason in articulating his understanding of Judaism, seeing Judaism as a combination of natural religion and the Mosaic legislation. Meyer was fully aware of the existence of what he called enlightened theologians, yet he gives us only the vaguest notion of their positions, and in fact hints, in the spirit of Peter Gay, that perhaps they were closet deists or unbelievers. I quote, most of the Aufklärung theologians, Enlightenment theologians, Spalding, Reimarus, and Jerusalem, preferred not to deny revelation, at least in their published works, while, however, concentrating their attention on the, and this is a quotation within his, my quotation from him, humane, cheerful, this worldly, practical, simply understood, and modern religion of healthy common sense. Okay, now, what's interesting is that Meyer took this quotation characterizing Enlightenment, the enlightened theologians, from a study of the mystical thinker Johann Georg Hamann that was first published in 1911. It is a clear but superficial characterization of Enlightenment theology that is in fact fundamentally misleading. It echoes the views of neo-romantic scholars at the beginning of the 20th century who were not just unsympathetic, but indeed hostile to the Enlightenment and Enlightenment theology. Thus, Mayer's view of the world in which Mendelssohn functioned was constrained by the straitjacket of the notion of an essentially secular enlightenment and a limited enlightenment theology whose adherents, given that the Enlightenment was secular, were probably not entirely honest about their true beliefs. This world did not provide a range of options of reasonable religion, that is, a range of peers whom Mendelssohn could admire or emulate or be compared to. Tacit but unmistakable in Mayer's narrative is the sense that Mendelssohn was a singular figure in subscribing both to Enlightenment philosophy and to revelation. Altman's biography, which we've already discussed in regard to Germanization, needs to be examined here as well. Altman was fully aware of Enlightened theology, or what he called the Berlin theology of the Enlightenment. Yet he did not treat this as an independent phenomenon worthy of exposition at any point in his book. For example, Altman mentioned the first book of philosophy, not theology, but philosophy, that Mendelssohn read in German. This, in fact, was a work of Christian theology, Johann Gustav Reinbeck's Considerations of the Augsburg Confession, 1733, a series of sermons marking the centenary of that confession. Altman gives the titles of the chapters in the first part of the work. He then writes, "The whole work is written in a spirit of rationality and reflects the influence of the Enlightenment." In the preface to Part 3, Reinbeck tells his Orthodox critics that the truths founded on reason are, quote, "after all, likewise precious divine truths," end of quote, and that, quote, "one does not disgrace the truths of Holy Scripture by connecting them with the truths of reason," end of quote. By a stroke of good luck, then, Mendelssohn's first encounter with Christian theology was with an Enlightenment specimen of it. It gave him a sense of the clash between Wolff and his Orthodox opponents, and brought the Wolffian philosophy immediately to his attention. End of quote. Altman clearly does not treat Reinbeck's work as a representative of an entire school of Christian theology, the so-called theological Wolffians, whose ideas he could have summarized. Moreover, he gives no sense that Mendelssohn would in fact emulate Reinbeck and other theological Wolffians by articulating a sort of Jewish theological Wolffianism. Altman's reluctance to deal directly with enlightened Christian theology finds its most pointed expression in his exposition of the Lafayette affair. Altman devotes 50 dense pages of detailed analysis to the ins and outs of Mendelssohn's encounter with the chiliastic Swiss professor who tried to convert him in 1769-70. Altman examined every relevant document and carefully scrutinized the role of what he called the phalanx of the Berlin Enlightenment theology, whom Altman claims were as much Mendelssohn's true adversary at the time as Lafayette himself. Yet nowhere in that lengthy account does Altman give a sense of the actual ideas and beliefs of those theologians, many of whom were prolific, and some of whom were the authors of bestsellers. He does suggest that they were reluctant to discuss their notion of purified Christianity in the full glare of publicity because it was too hazy or vague, and Altman in fact insinuates the possibility that that was the case because that they were deists or heretics. Again, the regnant notion of enlightenment seems to preclude a full recognition of the contents and viability of enlightened Christian theology. Thus, once again, Mendelssohn appears as a singular figure without peers or theological kindred. Now let me talk about how scholarship on the Enlightenment has changed in the last 3 or so decades and opened up new ways of seeing Mendelssohn. In 1981, Roy Porter and Mikulas Teich offered an alternative to Gay's notion of a unitary, secularizing Enlightenment in their jointly edited The Enlightenment in National Context, published by Cambridge University Press. The volume might be said to have established the plurality school of diverse enlightenments. The 13 contributors overwhelmingly demonstrated that there were numerous versions of the Enlightenment across Europe. While some versions were discernibly secularizing, others were unmistakably based on religious foundations or were at least compatible with, if not overtly friendly to, religious belief. The volume focused on the social history of culture or the sociology of knowledge, and also scrutinized the quote, diffusion of Enlightenment ideas across cultural boundaries. It inspired other historians to examine in depth the social history of various examples of Enlightenment. It has led to a vast accumulation of scholarship in the past few decades. J.G.A. Pocock built on this scholarship when he suggested that there was, quote, a family of Enlightenments. Two additional trends in Enlightenment scholarship deserve mention. In an amazing feat of synthesis, Jonathan Israel has mastered the scholarship in numerous languages that accumulated in the previous decades in response to the Porter-Teich volume. In two massive tomes, with a third on the way, Jonathan Israel has redrawn the map of the Enlightenment, arguing that what Peter Gay saw as the rise of modern paganism, Voltaire and Hume in particular, was in fact more Christian than pagan and constituted the moderate or mainstream Enlightenment. He understands this moderate Enlightenment to espouse a sort of providential deism, including, quote, belief in creation, divine providence, the divine origin and absolute validity of morality, the special role of Christ, and the immortality of the soul, end of quote. This moderate mainstream was, according to Jonathan Israel, quote, overwhelmingly dominant in terms of support, official approval, and prestige, practically everywhere except for a few decades in France from the 1740s onwards. It had, according to Jonathan Israel, three rival versions: the Neo-Cartesian in France, the Newtonian, particularly in England and in Italy, reinforced with Locke, and Leibnizian Wolffianism, particularly in German-speaking Central Europe. All three relied on physico-theology, or the argument from design, which, quote, was the strongest single intellectual pillar buttressing the moderate mainstream Enlightenment, and was often combined with the defense of miracles. The truly radical Enlightenment, whose legacy Israel would like to reclaim, was the materialist, anti-clerical, anti-Christian, egalitarian, and democratic version of Baruch Spinoza, Pierre Bayle, and Denis Diderot, etc. With this distinction between the moderate mainstream and radical materialist versions of the Enlightenment, Israel has thereby opened up a new space for Enlightenment theology. The last trend in the scholarship is that of the religious Enlightenment. This approach uses the plurality that Porter and Teich identified, and through comparison posits that there were underlying commonalities that permit us to speak, as Dale Van Clay has done, of a, quote, northern crescent of Protestant Enlightenment and a southern crescent of Catholic Enlightenment. I would argue that the religious Enlightenment overlaps with, yet is distinct from Jonathan Israel's moderate mainstream Enlightenment, and I have tried to incorporate a figure such as Mendelssohn into this analysis, and on that basis insisted on speaking not of a Christian, but rather of a religious Enlightenment. Mendelssohn is then not a singular figure, but is comparable to Protestants such as the moderate Anglican William Warburton, the Arminian Calvinist Jacob Vernet in Geneva, or the holotheological Wolffian Sigmund Jakob Baumgarten, or to such Catholic figures as the French patriotic priest Adrien Lamourette. All of these figures endeavored to fashion versions of reasonable religion that balanced between faith and reason, science and scripture, revelation and reason. Doing so entailed renewing inherited forms of biblical exegesis. They all also embraced the idea of toleration, using ecclesiastical natural law theory to defend the individual's freedom of conscience and sovereignty in relationship to the church or synagogue as a voluntary institution. These religious enlighteners were active in the public sphere, many of them gaining reputations as literary critics, historians, or philosophers, in addition to theology. Now, to summarize, removing the two scholarly straitjackets of Germanization and a secular or secularizing Enlightenment has enabled scholars to view Mendelssohn in new ways. For example, in The Limits of Enlightenment, Jews, Germans, an 18th Century Study of Scripture, published in 1996, Edward Breuer studied Mendelssohn's Bible translation and commentary in relationship to rabbinic tradition and 18th century scholarship, emphasizing the conservative character of Mendelssohn's magnum opus. Carola Hilfrich, in 2000, published a searching investigation of Mendelssohn's semiotics of representation and idolatry based on both the German and Hebrew works. In his major biography in French in 2004, Dominique Burel devoted a chapter to the translation and commentary on the Pentateuch, as well as discussing the translation of Psalms and the earlier commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes. He also located Mendelssohn within the Enlightenment theology of Prussia and the German states. Our next speaker, Micha Gottlieb, has integrated the Hebrew works into an analysis of Mendelssohn as a philosopher trying to formulate his own position between Maimonides' Aristotelianism and Spinoza's anti-supernaturalism. With 3 other colleagues, Micha has also produced an anthology of Mendelssohn's works that includes selections from the Hebrew works. As part of the resuscitated Jubilee edition, the Jubiläumsausgabe, Frohman Publishers has produced German translations of the Hebrew works. The 3 main early works, the Kohelet Musar, the commentary on the logical terms, Biur Milot HaHigayon, and the commentary on Ecclesiastes, Biur Megillat Kohelet, appear in 1 volume. The Pentateuch translation appears in 3 separate volumes. With the removal of the 2 straitjackets that have hobbled the understanding of Mendelssohn, we can now probe Mendelssohn's views on Judaism with greater depth and in endless detail by studying the Hebrew works that he wrote throughout his career. And we can see that his attempt to fashion a reasonable understanding of Judaism using Enlightenment ideas of natural religion and natural law was part and parcel of the larger phenomenon of the religious Enlightenment. We are now in a position to assess from anew the nature and quality of his accomplishments. Thank you.